Well, let's go ahead and get started. Looks like we've got a nice bunch into our webinar platform already. Today, brought to you by Cleanfax, is this free webinar called The Ultimate Exit Plan: Strategies to Assess, Enhance, and Maximize the Value of Your Company. And you can see our panelists here on the screen. We're not going to introduce them yet. We'll do that in a moment. We'll talk about what they do, and they can actually share that with you themselves. But such great experience we have here to talk to you and help you with selling your business. So as we move into our webinar, you probably know already from my speaking, I'm Jeff Cross, the ISSA Media Director. I also run Cleanfax Magazine, and be sure to receive that if you have not done so. It looks like this, but go to cleanfax.com, click the subscribe button, and you can get your copy sent to you. But I'm not doing this alone. We have Martha Schmidt. She's our ISSA virtual events producer. That's her favorite picture of herself. If she wants to argue that point, she can hop on and do that, but she probably won't. But that's Martha. And then we have Elizabeth Christensen, editor. She's my partner in Cleanfax, running that magazine, and she'll be watching the chat and answering questions as needed. So we have a nice team here to help you in this webinar today. So before we get officially started with the content, I do want to mention that interaction is important. Even though you can't speak to us verbally, we can't see you as webinar attendees. We will watch the chat, we will watch the Q&A, and we can communicate that way. There'll be a recording of this that you'll receive when you get that. It's for you, but share it as well. If you'd like to send it to colleagues or others that you feel can benefit from it, that copy is your copy. And you can also see this on cleanfax.com. It'll take a couple of days to render the recording, get it all ready, but that will be available soon. And you are automatically muted except for our panelists, but all you attendees are muted, so you don't have to worry about any background noise. But let's get to know our panelists. Here we have with us today JT Cry with Exit Strategies 360, Jennifer Sharp with Dry Kings Restoration, Chuck Violan with Violan Management Associates, and Mark Springer with Ortis Advisors. I hope I said that right, Mark. Ortis.
Sure. You're right
All
on the
right.
money, Jeff.
So what a great group we have here today. Normally we do a webinar in an hour, but since we have so many questions to answer and so much expertise to share, we might go over time. And if you need to leave at the hour, we won't penalize you for that, but you might miss some good stuff. But the longest we'll go will be probably an extra half an hour. But let's get into our first question, our first topic. And what I want to do here is invite each panelist to comment on this. And also maybe before they do that, share a little bit about themselves, their company, and what they hope to bring to you in the industry. So Jennifer, ladies first, why don't you unmute yourself
Thank
and
you,
share
Jeff.
your information?
Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation and you having me here. My name is Jenny Sharp. I'm the founder of Dry Kings Restoration. We're based out of San Francisco in California. I'm actually from Germany originally. I was born and raised in Stuttgart, and I came to the United States in 2017 with two suitcases and a few $1,000s in savings. And I started Dry Kings Restoration out of a garage with my husband, Matthew. And we scaled the company really quickly to about 30 employees. And we never really knew that exiting was a possibility until we talked to a consultant a while ago. And he told us that he sold his company. And that was first when we understood there was a market for it. So really at the beginning, we just focused on building a premier provider for restoration services. And it was a lot of fun scaling systems, building teams and processes around like just delivering like a really top-notch service. And yeah, Dry Kings doubled year over year over year. It's really exciting. I had my daughter a few years ago. And that was kind of when my husband and I started thinking more about a future plan and considered other options. And we talked to JT, and JT did an amazing job leading us through evaluation, really understanding the metrics that drive the value of a company, and then ultimately leading us through an exit. We sold to Guardian Restoration Partners, they're an equity firm. And that bought us last year. And so it has been a really exciting process. I learned a lot. And yeah, just here today to share my experience. Yeah, and hopefully can pass on some knowledge that I obtained the last few years in the process.
What I have to say about our panelists is most of them have built and sold their companies. So this is the real deal here today. But Jenny, when should business owners start thinking about this? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so initially we didn't think about an exit plan, but a few years in, we started realizing it was an option. So really, if you're in that place where you realize like, hey, this could be an option, so I think it's really good to start planning because it will take a few years to get to your company in a place where, depending on what your goal is, where you can exit successfully. So for us, it took a few years, and it was a really great process. So the sooner you can start, the better for sure.
Sooner the better. I figured that was the case. Mark Springer, tell us about yourself a little bit and what you have done.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And I just want to say thank you. It's such an honor to be part of such a distinguished panel that you've put together, and certainly appreciate the support that ISSA and Cleanfax provide to the restoration industry. The education that you guys have provided over the years has been invaluable to so many restorers, including myself. So thank you for doing this. So I grew up in the restoration industry. My dad started the company Dayspring Restoration back in 1989. I didn't have a choice initially as to whether or not I was going to be involved with the restoration companies. So, of course, I've seen a lot of change over the years, been incredibly blessed to be able to grow a company across the state of Montana. We sold our company in the winter, December of 2020. So right in the middle of COVID, a really interesting time to go through this whole process. Dayspring, with its 7 locations, became the initial investment for what is now Fleet Response, which is a national company now with, I think, around 30 locations around the country. So certainly an exciting thing to be a part of that from the ground floor. I left the company the end of last year. It's actually not last year. I guess it'd be the year before. So it'd be the end of 23. I still got to adjust my mind to this 2025 stuff. So yeah, been out of the company now for about a year. Started now the work that I'm in, Ortis Advisors. Ortis is actually the Latin word for dayspring, which is a word for new beginning. So it was a new beginning for me. Of course, dayspring is always a new beginning for our customers who experience fires and floods. And so I do exit planning now. So I last year got certified beginning of 2024 as a certified exit planning advisor with the Planning Institute. And so the work I do right now is helping businesses to scale and then ultimately maximize their exit. So to your question, when should business owners start planning their exit strategy? I would say this, they should start planning their exit strategy right away, even if they never plan on exiting, because the premise is this, an exit ready business is a valuable business. Even if you don't sell your company in the near future, your business is going to be far more valuable if it is prepared to sell. You will run your business better if you're prepared to sell. And here's the bottom line. None of us, many of us, don't necessarily plan on selling. There's these things that happen in our lives that require a sale. And so preparing for that is the right thing to do for your family and the team that you've built. So that would be my answer to that question.
I like that answer too, and I love how you kept the same name for your new adventure in a different language. Yeah, that's really cool.
Thank
Let's
you.
go to Chuck. Chuck Violand. Chuck and I do a lot of videos. So Chuck, tell us about yourself and what you've been through.
Thanks, Jeff. And just as the others have said, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's quite an illustrious group. I'm honored. Um, well, I'm the founder of Violand Management Associates, no longer the owner. We took a slightly different path. Violand Management is a consulting company to small businesses, primarily in the trades, people who make money with their hands. Our primary market is disaster restoration, but we also work in other trades, plumbing, building service contractors, HVAC, excuse me.
Mhm.
However, we took a slightly different path when it was time to transition our company. I know that as an advisor, what I'm supposed to say is you start thinking about selling it the day you start it. You look at your successors. And I think that is good advice. But from a practical perspective, I think it's one that most small business owners don't take. They're so consumed with other things going on that they're not thinking about selling it. But to Mark's point, I think it's a wise move to think about selling it and to run your business as if you want to sell it, because you'll make better decisions that way. But in addition to making better decisions, what I've also found is that it's a whole lot more fun to run a business that's being run right and that is ready to be sold. So not only will you do better when the time comes to sell it, you're going to have a whole lot more fun running it, especially with the people that you need to surround yourself with in order to have value in that business as you run it. So
Good advice. And JT Cry is, I don't think you've ever been a cleaner or restorer, have you?
I have not. No.
Okay. But this is your world. Talk about what you do and answer the question for us.
It is. Well, thank you, Jeff. Like everyone has said, it's an honor to be here. Quite a group. My company is called Exit Strategies, and I've been an M&A advisor now in the restoration space on a national level for the last 22 years or so, and an advisor in general terms in different companies before that. So coming up on 26, 27 years. I was an entrepreneur through the 90s, started and sold several companies, realized there was a really big need for good advice out there for business owners to really get an education. Many advisors want to skew the truth a little bit and not really educate their clients. And so I created a process to really provide great education. So really well-informed decisions could be made. If it's not well-informed, it's then ill-informed. And when there's this much at stake, the well-informed decisions are much better. So I don't have an agenda. I just want people to make good decisions. And if we can maximize the value of companies and resulting retirements, that's the goal for everybody. So when it comes to the question of exit planning, it does run the gamut. Chuck said it very well. You know, we're all been taught when you start a business, you think of the end in mind, and that never happened. You're just trying to get to Friday or the next payroll. And what happens is once you get to a place in business, and then Jenny mentioned it, when you think that it is a possibility, that's really when you can start to think about being exit ready. And Mark used the right term. And an exit ready business is a good one. And the fact is, a well-positioned company, they get to ask for and get premium results. That's just a fact. And if you can put a little effort into being well-positioned, the results will follow.
Good words. Thank you, JT. And thank you for giving up
Yeah.
some of your time today to be with us.
Thank you.
So let's talk about options on the table for those that want to do something with their business. We just discussed, you know, I think everyone said the same thing in a way. Start early. Even if you don't plan on doing it, you probably will. So those are good words of advice. But and JT, we'll stick with you on this and start with your thoughts, and then we'll move on to the next. What are the options out there for those that want to sell their company? Cleaning, restoration. I know that our panelists are all from the restoration industry, but this is for cleaners as well. It's for anyone that owns a company. What would you say to that?
Well, there's so many options. And one of the mistakes that owners make is they don't even understand the options. They don't ask enough questions. And to be clear, everyone's going to exit their business at some point, either on your terms or due to health or due to a divorce. We're all going to exit. And so if you go into it with that in mind, answers all of a sudden become a little more important. But there's so many options between key employees, stock redemption plans, management buyouts, on a third-party transactions. There can be what I call industry strategics. If you're thinking the first on sites and Belfours and ATIs and customs and, BMS, that whole slew of industry buyers. And then there's private equity. And the term private equity gets thrown out quite a bit, and people really don't even know all the segments to private equity. They just think it's a lot of, big company with money and they're going to spend it. They've got to park it somewhere to invest. And really, it can be wealth family offices. It can be search funds. It can be boutique firms. It can be search funds where we've got individuals who are financially backed. So there are a tremendous amount of options, and it is not a one size fits all, depending on the size and, more importantly, what the owner wants for the future. Oftentimes that'll help drive the type of buyer that we're looking for.
Thank you. And Chuck, we'll go to you next. Anything to add to that?
No, I agree with JT. I think that he covered, especially the private equity piece, pretty well. There are a lot of options, and with my particular situation at Viola Management, I intentionally did not go with did not look at outside purchasers. We had a long succession plan in place intentionally. And so we went with a management buyout. I sold the business to our general manager, who had been our general manager for 3 years. He'd been with the company for 16. Tim Hall. And so we were able to work an agreement out between the two of us. But what was very important to me was continuity of the company and making sure that it continued on its mission. And fortunately, I was very fortunate to have somebody within the company who felt the same, shared that same vision that I did.
If anyone wants to know who that is, it's on cleanfax.com right now because we just did an interview about the event coming up in July. Chuck, I know that was a good interview with Tim. Jennifer, let's go to you next. And what would you add to this conversation, the options and what you might do with your company?
Yeah, I really like what JT said about taking the time as an owner who considers an exit to look at all of your options. And it comes down to your personal goals, right? Where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself in that company long term? Do you see yourself not being part of that company? What's the timeline on that? And once you really get in touch with your personal goals, you can adjust your business goals and your exit strategy accordingly. And when we started kind of looking at exit options, we looked at employee stock ownership plan, we looked at owner financing, and we talked to some larger nationwide restoration companies who were interested potentially in buying a company and acquiring Dry Kings Restoration. And really, like I got more in touch with the factors that were important to me. And one of the things that I had heavily invested in, I have a degree in business and marketing branding. So we built a really, really strong local brand. And that was a key differentiator for Dry Kings Restoration to, as I said, like we position ourselves to be a premier provider of restoration services who work for large hospitals, government buildings. And so just that brand had a real value. And so for me, I couldn't really see that brand just being swallowed up by another company. And so for us, finding an equity partner, finding an investor, or kind of like an exit that kind of preserved that brand and our legacy that we built, that was really important for us. And we also acquired a building. It's the only castle-looking building in Marin County. So the Kings got their castle. So there's just that whole brand was important. And in Guardian Restoration Partners, one of the aspects that really gained my interest in them was that it is their mission to protect a local brand, that reputation. They don't just come in and change everything around. They leave the brand as it is, and they continue to build upon that. So that was one of the factors. The other factors that was important for me as well was Guardian Restoration Partners. They offer a CEO development program. And so what they do is they recruit a CEO, they take a CEO, and they place it into your company. And so I really like that aspect of like, I believe a stagnating company is a dying company. So really growth is the only path forward. And I want to see Dry Kings go to the moon. Even after our exit, I want to see Dry Kings continue to grow and that legacy to be preserved. And just knowing that there's a general manager, a CEO in place that is taking on the reins and that has the knowledge and skills and expertise to take Dry Kings to the next level. I feel like I own that to my employees and to the company. And that's where Guardian Restoration Partners really convinced us that they are the right partner for our specific situation. And so the general manager they brought in, his name is Steve. He managed a 250 million P&L previously, and he already came in and added a new referral stream just within a few months that he has been running the company. And he also restructured our organization for future success and growth. And so Dry Kings has continued to grow even after the acquisition. And therefore, I'm really grateful for the choice and definitely for our situation, Guardian Restoration Partners was perfect and a really, the best option for us.
Yeah, and all those on the webinar taking notes, different ways to do this, but it's good to hear that these are methods that work well, but you have to pick the one that is good for you. Mark Springer, the worst place to be in a question is last, but you're it.
Not with this group, not this group. I'm like I said, there's such a wealth of experience in this group. But I think as people look at this, one of the things that a lot of folks will express to me when it comes to selling their business, is this fear of the unknown and the fear of making the wrong decision. And so there's this emphasis on, okay, what's best? How do I make sure that I don't make a mistake? But really, it just comes down to the goals of the owner. What may be good for Jennifer may not be good for Chuck. It may be good for me, may not be good for me, right? But really, the place where an owner's personal, business, and financial goals, all three legs of those stool, can be met to ensure the outcome that's right for, again, the company, right for their family, right for their future. Those are the ones that have to be considered. And again, this isn't something that someone can just jump into. And this is, I think, one of the challenges we've seen in this industry over the last 4 or 5 years is that there's a reaction to what's happening and a little bit of a fear of missing out. I get people all the time, if you're at an industry conference or something like that, you'll hear people that almost have this paranoia or fear of being left out and not being part of all this consolidation. And for a lot of companies, selling might not be the right thing for them right now. They may not be ready to sell. They might be a great candidate for some companies. Would be a great candidate for certain strategics, but not for others. So, the most important thing is that those three legs of the stool: personal goals, financial goals, and business goals, are all identified and met.
Thank you. That's well said. Let's talk about the money, the valuation that we need to think about as a business owner. So our next topic is business valuation, the metrics that define a company's true market value. And I think maybe the biggest question of the day, every day when you're selling your company, what's my company really worth? And that's important to know. Chuck, it's your turn to go first. What would you say to this topic?
I didn't think you were going to come to me on that one, Jeff.
Well, not
Actually, I would
everyone gets to
defer-
go first one time. So
I would defer to JT on in terms of coming up with the defining metrics on the value of business. He uses full disclosure, at our company, we happen to use JT to value VL and
okay.
management. And he did a great job on it. But in our particular case, we knew that we needed to come up with a number that both the buyer and the seller would agree with, rather than haggling over that number and having to go through all of that agony ahead of time, just trying to come to an agreeable number. And we were able to do that in fairly short order. So that was very helpful to me. I'll go back to Mark's comment. Your business, you have to take a look at those three considerations when you're looking at the value of the business. My experience in working with small business owners who want to sell is that many of them have a highly inflated view of the value of their business. And that many times, aside from the business, I mean, there are statistics on this too, Jeff, the number of small business owners who really have no retirement income or retirement plan beyond selling their business is criminal. They don't think in those terms. And so they end up at that point in life where, as JT was mentioning, either you're forced into it or you're just going to make a decision that isn't wise, and then you get hurt. So understand what that number is, your own personal number is, before you even start taking a look at what your business is worth. Then build your business to that rather than going the other direction.
Yeah. Good words, Chuck. And just so you know, JT, I want you to go last on this one so you can listen to everyone talk about this and then you can fill in the blanks.
Not
Okay.
a problem.
All right, Jenny, let's go to you next on this.
All right, so obviously there's the key metrics when it comes to valuation. EBITDA is the main one, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. So that's really, at the end of the day, if you look at it like in a simple way, it's basically net profits with some add backs. So you basically just look at like the bottom line, like are you running your business profitable? And usually that EBITDA is taken and then there's a multiplier depending on like your size and some other factors. And so that's at the end of the day, like what JT is really good at. He's, I think, here from all of us, and he's a master in valuations. He did our valuation as well. And I've really enjoyed the process. It's so interesting to understand the value of your company and then also understand what metrics drive that value. And so the way I look at it is like a valuation is an is assessment. So if you do a valuation, it doesn't mean you have to exit right away. It's more like understanding like what is the value of my company today. And then again, as Chuck already said really beautifully, it's like you come up with your own number, like what is the number that you need or want or have to exit at. And then you basically build a path there. And I always believe like having goals is so important. One thing that I learned from Viola Management is the annual business plans. Like that has been essential for us. Like you basically take your capital goals, you take your exit goals even, and you break them down into company goals per department. And then you break those down, into, even like down to KPIs for your individual key employees or, for management. And then you hold people accountable. And so for us, KPIs are key performance indicators. So really you, and again, like understanding the key metrics, super important, and then really defining, key performance indicators depending on those key metrics, and then building incentive plans around them for accountability. And so we started doing that more heavily when we defined an exit strategy. And that year we grew 70% in revenue, and we also maintained our profitability. And I really tie that back to obviously the prior years, we also had technology in place, had put technology in place to track all of that. Again, goals are great, but you have to be able to track it. But again, if you have the technology and then you're able to track it, helps immensely in ensuring, accountability towards those goals. And so when it comes to, an exit strategy, I think execution, right? Accountability goes hand in hand with the planning.
Thank you, Jenny. And Mark, you're up next.
All right. So I think your company's worth what someone's going to actually pay for the transaction. There's a big range there, right? So for example, when we sold our company, we had 13 LOIs. The range of those LOIs was the highest LOI was 100% more than the lowest LOI. So there's a big range there. So what is it? What's the company really worth? Well, it's worth what at the end, at the transaction, what it's sold for, right? So in these cases, there's a lot of variable. There's a lot of myth out there. I hear, again, back to the industry conferences, you hear people talking at the cocktail hour about, oh, I got 15 times EBITDA, or something like, oh, really? So I'd love to know all the details of what exactly was included in that consideration, right? Because there's earnouts and all other sorts of things that get lumped into this that knowing what the actual value is may be different than the story at the cocktail hour. But the important thing I think that anyone should think about and should focus on is that a good business has about 80% of its value in the intangible capital of the business. So these are the things in the business that create the value that really is going to be transformational for someone, their family, and whoever's part of their overall estate planning. And then these are in the things that, aren't what often restorers are drawn to. Again, back to the industry conferences, people are drawn to the big desiccant dehumidifiers and the fancy equipment and tools are out there. A lot of things that don't necessarily enhance the enterprise value. So what are these intangible capitals? These are the things that really people need to be able to work on to enhance the value. This is their people in the business, their customer base, their social capital. What is the reputation of the company? What is the culture of the company like? And then finally, its processes. How documented are those processes? The repeatability of the business and the ability for the business to operate without the owner there. If the business has a disproportionate amount of dependence on the owner's presence there in the business, the more the value goes down. So those are the areas that people need to be able to focus on so that they can have a best of class value, which is within this range that you'll typically see of multiples on an EBITDA. And hopefully, JT, I just totally set you up for that. just to
Thank
hit it
you,
out of the
Mark.
park now.
So we're going to skip JT on this question. No, just kidding. JT, what can you add to this? We have had some
Well,
good.
there's not a whole lot to add. Everyone did a great job. What I will say that valuation is a really funny thing. If you've been planning for it for years, you might have one value. And once a year on average, I get a phone call from an individual or a husband-wife team. They're sitting in a hospital parking lot and somebody's in tears and they said, we met a few years ago and I need your help right now. And those are very difficult conversations to have. And all of a sudden value isn't what it was 24 hours earlier. And so it's pretty easy to value a company 6 or 7 or 8 different ways, hit it with the multiple, and out pops this number. And this number has no idea what part of the restoration space you're in. It doesn't know whether you're residential or commercial. It doesn't know whether you're independent or franchise, whether you're direct or TPA. It doesn't know how clean your books are. It doesn't know how professional you are, what your turnover rate is, what your financial trend is. I look at 15 to 18 different variables, and Mark rattled off several. There's so many things that affect value. And Mark is correct. You hear these guys that get a drink or two in them and they'll say, I got X for my business. Or they'll say, I got 15X, to use Mark's example. And I will say, 15X of what? What was the multiple on? And they can't tell me. So there's so many things that drive value. As long as you're exit ready, come back to that term and done a little bit of planning, the value is going to be better than it would have been otherwise. And we can all tell horror stories on, bad values and good values and what that means. But this is one of those arenas where a business owner that's listening, they think, I don't have time for an exit strategy. Really, it's getting answers to 10 or 12 key questions, and they're not complicated. Once you get those answers, you're well on your way to an exit plan. And the future of the business and your confidence level, both will be boosted.
A lot of great
jump in and
information here. Go ahead, Mark.
sorry, I just realized someone asked a question about this acronym I threw out, LOI. So a LOI is a letter of intent, and that's typically how a deal might be at the very outset of a process, the initial terms of the deal. So sorry, I'll try to minimize those acronyms moving forward.
I think everyone in this industry knows that we are full of acronyms, so
Yeah.
nothing wrong with asking what one means, because there's too many of them.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about profitability versus perception. And I know the previous slide was great about drilling into the details and all those acronyms that we have, but maybe how a company might look or be perceived by a potential buyer. Any thoughts here to make it a better place for a business seller? And Jenny, we're starting with you on this one.
All right. Yeah, I actually have a degree in business and branding. So during the pandemic, my sister worked at a design agency in Germany, and they were slower at the time. They also work for larger German companies such as Mercedes and Porsche. They handle all of their branding and marketing. And so we were able to secure rebranding with them, and they rebranded a whole Dry Kings brand during the time. And I had people I talked to in the industry, and they raised their eyebrows. They're like, "Wow, $50,000 for rebranding? Are you sure that this is worth it? It's only a brand." And I was like, "Yeah, it's a brand." But I really had that theory, and it ended up paying off that a brand will attract larger clients. It will attract great talent. Like people work, they identify with the brand, right? And customers want to trust. So there's a lot of power in that you can build in a brand. And so I don't believe that it's good to like work on perception in the sense of like trying to make something look nice, but it's more enhancing the value that's already there. So I believe like at the end of the day, a brand like in marketing, like you have to hold your promises, right? You can't make promises that you can't live up to. So a brand is really only a tool to enhance the value that you already deliver. For us, we actually were late bloomers when it came to business development. We hyper-focused the first few years on operations, on really building systems and processes and making sure that we're able to consistently deliver, that we have the right people in the right places, and that we have a great reputation. And once we had that, we really, started business development and marketing and boasting it all over. And we attracted larger hospitals and even Gavin Newsom's sister, we did a job for. So there's a lot of really interesting situations that we ran into that I believe came back to a brand that we built intentionally. I also highly focused on online marketing. It became our main referral source. We got up to 70% last year from online marketing sources. So there's a lot of power that you have in getting reviews from your customers, right? Streamlining that, incentivizing that. We have a weekly wheel spin that we do with our technicians. So whoever obtained a 5-star review gets a gift card. Sometimes we throw in some ear pods or just some, at the end of the day, I really believe if your company wins, your employees should win as well. So if you tie, your company goals to, employee performance, that's usually where the magic happens. And so again, coming back to perception, like there's an immense power in focusing on a brand, even if it is more of an intangible value, right? I believe there's a lot of value, and that goes, starts right with employees, winning over employees, like attracting great talent, and then also attracting customers, and then investors that they're most likely going to go online and look you up. And if you don't have a website, they can find you. So have a website in place and make sure that you have a Google My Business listing, that you get those 5-star ratings if you do a good job. And there's a big difference between having 5 reviews or 500, right? So just make sure that you have a nice presentation, because people will, that's kind of like your business card. That's the first impression people are going to have. And if investor, potential buyer, looks you up online and sees that you're a reputable company, that will be a really nice first impression. And that matters. And then when it comes down to, profitability, again, perception profitability, as I said, should go hand in hand. Definitely never make promises that you can't hold. But on a profitability end, I believe it's just important to have really clear financial targets every year. As I said, we did the business planning with Viola, and that helped us immensely to define capital goals and then break them down per department. And at the end of the day, as a business owner, you need to understand what drives your revenue. And so there's different ways how you can increase revenue. If you look at scaling your company, you can make more out of what you have, right? If you, like, let's say, your closing ratio, that your team closes at 65%, right? You can get a lot more like revenue just out of closing better. So if you train your team, if you develop, like Matthew, my husband, he's really good at sales, and he designed a whole sales training program, and we increased our closing ratio. And so we didn't even add any referral sources. We just made more out of what we had, and we grew revenue that way. And obviously you can grow revenue by business development, marketing measures, adding referrals that way. And so that goes to driving revenue, and then profitability really comes down to efficiency, right? There's a word called margin erosion. So you have your gross margins. Like, gross margins reflect on how efficient you manage your jobs. And so there's different things, right? Like, your documentation. Do you have systems and processes in place to track the equipment that is out there, or is your team only accounting for half of the equipment and you losing out, right? Because that equipment isn't built. Or are there operational efficiencies? Are your technicians drinking coffee every morning for 2 hours, or are they getting out of the door? Because if they accumulate a bunch of unbillable hours, right? If they're out there, you can bill those hours. If they're in the office and they're there for a long time and there's inefficiencies, you lose out that way. So again, looking at margin improvements and eliminating margin erosion, really that's how you strengthen your profitability, how you increase your profitability, and your billing strategy, right? Your pricing. So there's a lot of different ways how you can approach profitability. But I believe, as I said, it kind of goes hand in hand with, you want to have that brand, that perception, people, the way people look at you from the outside, and then when they start diving deeper, making sure that you run a tight ship, and have all of your systems and procedures down, and continuously focus on maximizing efficiency in all the ways you can as a business owner.
This is such great information. I wish we were recording this. Oh, we are. And everyone will get a copy of this, so never fear about that. Jenny, good information. Exactly what I was looking for. Mark, you and I go way back. We've had many conversations, trade shows, casual stuff, business stuff. And in all of those, you were proud of Dayspring. Talk about this question and your own experience, in addition to what Jenny just shared.
Yeah, so I think that the one of the important pieces that anyone has to think about is putting themselves in the shoes of the investor. Who's going to be acquiring this company? Who's going to be taking this company over? And anyone who's going to make an investment in any business, any investment for that matter, wants to know that their investment's safe. They want to know that their investment's stable. They want to know that there's not going to be a sudden change once they're the new owners taking the helm of that investment, right? So, one of the ones we talked about a number of different things in the previous discussion about things that are important for being able to sell, but let's just kind of hone in on that issue of the customer base, that customer piece of the intangible capital. So as an investor, you want to have a customer base that isn't overly concentrated. Businesses that have one customer or a small group of customers that have a disproportionate piece of the overall income is a big challenge, right? So in our business, one of the things that we focused on was making sure that we had diversification of our lead generation sources, right? So I run into a lot of companies that they get really good at plumber referral programs, right? Or board up programs with fire chiefs, or maybe they have a really good agent support program that supports brokers and agents directly, and they kind of stop there, right? Instead of expanding and diversifying those sources of their customer base. And I love what Jenny talked about. She talked about something that we also really focused on. That was the digital side of the business. Having these different places that you don't become overly dependent on one lead generation source is just gets to that point, that irresistible investment question that you have. That's what makes an investor look at the business and say, okay, I believe that this EBITDA is sustainable, and that we can continue to see that not only sustain but grow over time. And so that's really what we focused on, and I think that makes a huge difference in the overall risk appetite of the investor.
Appreciate that, Mark. Uh, JT, let's go to you, and maybe your focus. Say what you like about this question, but also what you see when you look at companies beyond the numbers that makes them attractive. Go ahead.
Well, for the sake of time, I don't know, we'll kick it over to Chuck, but let me just tell a quick story. But first, I'll say that companies need to be profitable. When you're not making any money, it's tough to sell. Then value starts to default to a balance sheet, and that's not what we want. We want it to be based on earnings. And sometimes people get a little lax with the P&Ls and the cost controls and the percentage points falling to the bottom line. Jenny mentioned that. And no doubt Mark paid a lot of attention to that when he was an owner. But let me tell you a story, because what we say a business is got to be proven. And that's what happens in due diligence. And if you've ever been given a due diligence list and it's got 10 or 11 tabs on a big Excel spreadsheet and there's 50 to 100 questions per tab, it'll take the normal business owner right off their chair. It's a lot. And it feels like a deep cavity search going to a doctor. There's no place to hide in due diligence. Everything we said it is, we've got to prove it. And so when it comes to profitability, and I mentioned some owners get lax, let me tell you a quick story. A year ago, I delivered a valuation to an individual who was doing about 20 million a year in sales, and the cost of goods was very, very steady. And I said, why is it this year? This was year end 23 at the time. I said, why is it that your cost of goods is at 3%? And he said, oh, it's just 3%. Don't worry about it. And I said, I'd like to stay here for a minute. And I said, can I put some math to that for you? And he said, certainly. And I said, listen, you're of the size, you're going to transact at 7, 7.5, maybe even an 8 multiple. This was a good sized business, very profitable. And I said, 3% in your cost of goods on 20 million is $600,000. There's $600,000 that should have been on the bottom line and wasn't. You take that times the multiple of 7, it's $4.2 million in value that's been lost because of that 3%. And when I explained that to him, the look I got through my Zoom meeting was pretty intense. And I said, can you fix this? And he said, yes. And I said, do you know where it is? And he said, I think so. And we've stayed in touch. He's fixed it. And just like that, there's $4.2 million added in his value. So when it comes to getting lean and profitable, every percentage point matters. And so many people, and COVID was good for us this way. It made decent operators into good operators. We really had to think about the bottom line in many aspects, but do not get lax about the percentage points hitting the bottom line. It's very much tied to real money. And if you can have somebody point that out 2 or 3 years in advance and give you a runway to fix it, it turns out pretty well.
That's a interesting story. Scary. And I'd love to know where that 3% went, but that's another topic.
Yeah.
Chuck's going to say it was the boat, but I don't know.
Everybody remembers the boats, Jeff.
The boat. Yes, I remember. All right, Chuck, you're up. What would you add to this?
You know, there's been so much good information from all three of these guys that I'm not sure how much I knew I have to add to it. Maybe I can just rearrange some of it. So much of the value of the business comes back to sustainability of the profitability of the company. We use a term at Viola Management called sustained profitable growth. And quite frankly, that's what we work at with our clients, as well as with our own organization. The sustainable part is the key to this thing. Obviously, profit is too, but the sustainable part is the key to it. JT touched on this. I think Mark did too. You know, if the company is overly dependent on the owner, it's not sustainable. If it's overly dependent on one person in the organization, it's not sustainable. If it's overly dependent on one customer or a handful of customers, it's not sustainable. In the disaster space, if it's overly dependent on seasonal disasters, then it's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. So your work at gaining sustainability in the profitability of your business, that's the key. And a lot of times that just gets down to tweaking things. But you can do that. You want to remove the dependence that the business has on you, the value of the business goes up. If it's dependent on you, all an owner is going to do is buy a job. So you don't want that to be the case. The other thing that I want to point out, Jenny was talking about this, and that's the relationship of the company Because the question on the table is, how can I transform a company into an irresistible investment? A lot of that has to do with reputation and the relationships that you have. We use the term, it seems to have become popular lately, called runway. And the runway is how much time you have to turn a business around, how much time you have to grow profitability, whatever it is, however you want to view it. Your reputation is your runway. And if somebody's buying your business, they want to make sure that they've got enough runway to keep this thing going and to get it up off the ground. And so when your reputation is good, or when the relationships that you've established over time are strong, they have a lot of runway out ahead of them to get this business transitioned to a new owner. And there's always going to be disruption when you transition to a new owner, even in the best of circumstances. So you need the runway. Having a great reputation in the market and having great relationships, both with your internal people, but also with your customers and your communities, gives a lot of runway to a new buyer, which will increase the value of the business.
Very good. We're getting some great information here today. Our next topic, industry trends. Mark, we'll start with you on this one. We'll have a few more slides, then we'll do our Q&A, because we promise we'll get to a lot of these questions that we've received. What do you think about this? How do you stay ahead of the industry's changing, cleaning changes, especially restoration? What do you think?
Well, I think the first thing that owners need to understand and focus on gets back to, I'll just maybe underscore a little bit what JT was talking about with profitability. It's really important that owners understand where their profitability should be within a range of value, and really what makes a best of class company in the restoration space, because that's what you're going to be compared to if and when you go to face that valuation question that is of course the top of everyone's mind. So, really understanding where the industry is and where I fit in that right now will help give the team, the people, the management and leadership team in the organization, particularly, the targets that they need to be shooting for to be able to enhance that. There is some great resources in the industry. RIA put out last year the cost of doing business report in partnership with Know How. And there was great information in there about where the industry is now. And so I think, more important than staying ahead of trends, because that can be something that a lot of people, get this sort of, in the industry, we have a propensity to chase shiny objects sometimes. And the more important thing is, again, stability in the earnings. If someone looks at it, if in the process of selling the company, and then you get into the due diligence that JT was talking about just a second ago, all those flaws are going to be revealed. You can't get through a quality of earnings audit and hide these issues. So, I mean, I think the most important thing there is again, just making sure you understand where your company needs to be a best of class within the restoration space, and focus on that rather than trends that are always changing and evolving. A stable business that, again, puts, as JT said very well earlier, focusing on the profitability consistently. The companies that have these, a good solid year, but then 2 weak years, and then another solid year, and you see these peaks and valleys that are that happen over time, just undermines the valuation of that enterprise tremendously.
Thank you, Mark. Go ahead, JT. What would you add to this?
Well, I'll just add a couple of quick stories.
You
Mark
have good
mentioned
stories.
it. So, well, thank you. I think we all have good horror stories. This is the restoration space, Jeff. Come on. And, Chuck mentioned it. Mark mentioned it. 3 years ago, when the northern half of Texas froze, I got 11 or 12 phone calls from Texas contractors. This is the year we're going to sell. And I said, let me guess, you're up about 500% the first 6 months of the year. And they said, yes. Well, nobody buys the company on one big weather event. It just doesn't happen. And, Chuck mentioned weather event. We can call it cat work, large loss. I prefer the cat work term. And so the cat work is a high risk, high stakes game. And what many companies do is, to Mark's point, they look for the bread and the butter, the consistency, the day in, the day out. What can we repeat the next 12, 18, 24 months? And if you get a really large loss, a big cat project, it looks great on your P&L. That money comes in and it hits the bottom line and it looks spectacular. Most companies will remove that. They're going to adjust and normalize your books to take that away because it's not repeatable. And if it happens every third or fourth or fifth year, we can build in some incentives to maybe recover that moving forward. But Mark said it comes down to what's repeatable, and the industry trends, whether it's TPAs or technology, those differ. I just sold a company a year ago that primarily is in yellow pages, and I never thought I'd hear that in the last 15, 18 years. But the average age of this community was about 75, and they did a lot of retirement work, and that's still where people went. So trends they can be slippery things. But I think for the most part, people have a hold of trends for their area and for their businesses.
Appreciate that. For the sake of time, Chuck, do you have something to add to this?
Really both of the guys, Mark and JT, both, and Jenny hasn't had a chance to weigh in yet, but they both make solid points on this thing. Tim Hall, our new owner, once commented to me when we were having a discussion about business and what works and what doesn't. He says, fundamentals always prevail. And I 100% agree with that comment. And we've seen it over and over 37 years of working with clients. The ones who pay attention to what needs to be paid attention to and don't get distracted with trends or things that might not be important. Focus on profitability, focus on your people, focus on changes in technology, but not necessarily trends in technology. And you're going to do okay. And don't get distracted by all the noise that's out there.
Good words. And Jenny, wrap this one up for us.
Yeah, industry trends. It's a lot of external factors, and as business owners, I believe it makes a lot of sense to focus on what we have power over, right, on our circle of influence. And I believe in extreme ownership, right? At the end of the day, as an owner, manager, you are responsible for every single thing that happens in your company. And if you focus on what we can change, there's a lot more change that comes from that than if we freak out over things that we can't change and external factors. But still, Wayne, and it is really important to stay informed. I believe that was said previously, but just if you follow the RI, if you join industry events, and there's some Facebook groups, and it's just really important, webinars like this one to really stay ahead. I love Jeff's work and just really making sure that there's you stay on the pulse of industry trends and understanding kind of like how your company relates to that. One practical example from DryKings last year, we had our earnout period, and a few months in, we heard the news that some larger carriers are leaving California. So that's one of the trends here. And obviously, generally in California with insurances, the insurance sector here is changing all across the United States. But that is obviously one of the trends we don't really have influence over, but we can still choose how if we see that as a threat or if we see that as an opportunity. And what we decided is that we were going to see it as an opportunity to diversify our revenue streams. And what we started going after is hospital work, government work, and focus our business development efforts in that. And we onboarded with 7 hospitals last year, and we got over $1 million of work from that. And that's all self-pay. So not, you don't have to hustle with insurance companies. You really, we get paid, there's no questions. And it's prevailing wages. Our guys love it. They get paid 3 times as much as they would on regular jobs. So again, you have to make sure you report to the Department of Industrial Relations. There's a process to that. Definitely recommend doing some more research before starting to get into prevailing wages. But it is a really great sector to be in. And so again, I don't necessarily would say it. I would say it's important to focus on diversifying revenue streams. So commercial is great as an addition to residential. Usually, most investors like to see a good mix. We at DryKings have had 70% residential, 30% commercial, and that was seen as a healthy mix.
Thank you, Jenny. We are at the top of the hour, so let's turn our slides off and go into our Q&A. And we have several questions that were given to us during the webinar and several given to us as people registered for this event. So this is going to be fun. Let's go with this one to start with. And here I'm going to have to kind of change the wording of this a bit. Employees are often buyers. How do we maintain the relationship if you do not sell to the employee or you sell to others? Owner financing is frequently needed. How do we get some security so a buyer has skin in the game? So Chuck, you sold your business to an employee. What if that hadn't worked out? What would you do to maintain that relationship? Could you talk to that?
I think that there were a couple of different questions that were posed in that. Number one is, how do you deal with the people in your organization? In
Right.
our particular case, and certain what I would advise is transparency. You want to be candid with the people in your organization. Do not make it a surprise. When people don't have information, they will make information up on their own. And usually it's incorrect and it just isn't going to end well. So be as forthcoming as you can with everything you can. At least that's the culture that we've tried to establish at our organization. It seemed to have worked. As far as financing, if you're, the old rule of thumb goes, if you want to make the best multiple on the sale of your business, you go to private equity. If you want to have something that might last, that might leave a legacy, then you might sell to an inside buyer. That was just the choice that we made. And yeah, I mean, you have to get creative with the financing of it. But there are options out there. SBA is very, very helpful in helping fund the purchase of businesses. But there's a lot of other options too. I'm sure JT can speak to a lot of those better than I can. But candor, honest to goodness, I mean, candor, and start early. Don't let it be a surprise.
Good advice. Yeah, there were a lot of components to that question, but let's do this, JT. Can you follow Chuck there? But we have another question. We'll kind of blend it together. So I'm
Okay.
thinking of selling to a longtime employee. What are your thoughts on a down payment and carrying the balance over time? That seems like a simple question, but it might not be that easy.
That is not a simple question, and I'll try
Okay.
to add to what Chuck says. Yeah, and the blanket comment from 30,000 feet is this is about managing expectations. I get calls every week from somebody saying, I'd love to sell to my key employee. We think we're a $10 million business. They don't have that kind of money. So what are our options? Well, they think the employee has to have $10 million laying around, and they don't have to. So there are a lot of options. SBA is good up to 8 or 9 million. Frankly, there's bridge loans out there. There's two banks doing really solid bridge loans. There's stock redemption plans. There's things that can be done. And when the mistake that happens when selling to a key employee is that you have a very simple conversation. An owner might say, "Oh, I'm not going to work here forever," and somebody might say, GM or a PM or an estimator might say, "I'd love to own a business like this," and you stand in the shop and you swap notes, and pretty soon everyone thinks they've got a deal put together, and the owner might be 5 or 8 or 10 years out, and the buyer doesn't have any money, and what they hear in those conversations is very separate from what was said. And so really getting clarity on details and expectations goes a long way to managing those expectations, because they can be very damning to the relationship and business. And what can happen if you're not clear is pretty soon that guy's feelings are hurt and they're going to go to work somewhere else. And it had the opposite effect of what you're trying to accomplish. So to go in with eyes wide open and to be clear, and candor, I think, was a term that Chuck used. You have to. And the expectations of a buyer really have to be set, because it's one thing for, let's say, a PM to say, we'd love to buy the business, I'm in. And then they have to go home and talk to their spouse and say, honey, are you okay with mortgaging the house and raiding our 401k and asking Uncle Phil for money? And then it's a totally different conversation, right? And so there's a difference between being interested and being committed. And you've got to find that out early. And if you don't, it's not going to end well.
Appreciate that. Jenny, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think
Being someone who sold a
Chuck
company,
and
right?
JT already covered it well.
Okay, right. Um, we have a one here for Mark. You sitting down, Mark?
Best I can. I mean, best I can in a hotel room.
What can an owner do to prepare for and survive due diligence without compromising the deal or having to retrade the valuation?
So again, I think this comes, this and the other, the question you just posed that Chuck and JT answered sort of fit in the same vein. It comes down to prior planning, and it's why it makes so much sense, even if you're not planning on selling right away in the next year, in the next 2 years, to be starting to think about this process. Particularly in the area, when someone goes through due diligence, a lot of it's focused on the financials of the business. It's the balance sheets, it's the P&L, it's the statements of cash flows. It's these things that a lot of times you see restoration company owners not emphasizing or prioritizing in their business. But it's so important for actually getting through to the other side of having a successful transaction. And so, one of the things that we did that I'm so grateful that we did before we sold is, we invested heavily in the administrative support side of the business and the finance side of the business. I had hired a CFO who came from a much larger organization than ours when before he came in, and we had audited financials before we actually even went through a process of thinking that we might be selling. And that just gave us sort of this vantage point to look at the business through this lens of how, a more sophisticated accounting-based organization was going to look at our company. And so that really helped a lot, I think, with preparing for due diligence and being able to sort of weather that pretty significant event that like JT already said, you're gonna fall out of your chair when you get that data room with all those requests. And so preparing for that's pretty important.
Good information. Anyone want to add to that before we move to another question?
Yeah, I would just say having the right technology in place helps immensely. For us, we implemented a heavier job management software than we needed a few years back. And same goes for accounting, even for HR. We were actually pretty heavy on technology for the size company that we were at, but it helped immensely in due diligence. It really streamlined the whole process because all the reports were on my fingertips. And I would say, even if you don't have a exit plan for the near future, just having that technology, having those reports, it makes a huge difference in the management of your organization. So I would say, definitely look into streamlining and finding solutions in regards to getting reports for all areas of your business, because it's going to make a difference and it's going to help you. And it even, from an investment perspective, is beneficial if everything is really transparent.
Thank you, Jenny. Anyone else? All right. We have a lot of our webinars attendees who are smaller companies than what we've been talking about. Let's focus on them for a few minutes. And Chuck, here's one for you. I'm in my 30s and building my company for about 8 years. I don't have a desire to build a large company. We probably don't hear that too often, but what can I expect to sell my company for if I only have a handful of people working for me?
Yeah, you don't hear it very often from a small business owner that they don't want to build a big company. But the reality is that many of them, at the end of the day, their actions speak differently than their words do. And they're not equipped or interested in really growing a very large business. When that's the case, a couple of different things, Jeff. Number one would be, again, as we've already said, and this sounds redundant, but run your business now as if you want to sell it, so that you can be ready to sell it on the flip of a switch. The second thing is that make sure that you're running it profitably enough that you can set money aside now for your future retirement, so that you aren't overly dependent on an unrealistic number that you're expecting to get from the sale of your business. But run it now profitably, set the money aside, have fun with it, and run it correctly so that you do get maximum when you do go to sell it. Those are some of the things that I would be looking at. And that includes people, technology, marketing, all of those components.
JT, when you have a potential client asking you this question, what do you look for to make it work?
Well, there's a point where people do just buy a job. And if you're so small and you've got, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 trucks and 4 or 5 employees and 1 admin in the office, those are tough sells because they're typically so dependent on an owner. And we've got owners out there wearing 15 hats just to survive. And the question that always gets asked is, how dependent on the owner is it? And if we can say that the owner's wearing 2 or 3 hats, not 15 to 18, it's instantly much more transferable. So there is a point where if it's so dependent on you, it is transferable, but probably at a price that's not acceptable. And so it's a point of diminishing return where you have to grow at least to scale to a point where it's not that dependent. And if it is, it's a disappointing number if you choose to stay small. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I sold a company in Kansas City several years ago that was doing over $20 million with 5 employees. It was a very unique model. I won't go into details, but it was an incredible model, actually. And so it's not so much the number of employees that you have, it's how you're built. And is it the traditional model that we all think of when we think of mitigation restoration being full service, or is it something different? Well, there's a couple of something different out there that are pretty appealing at times. And it had been built this way 35 years ago. So comes down to making some money, and that's going to help drive the buyer.
I want that guy's model, JT.
Yeah, it was a good one.
So have a conversation later. You'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You hear
just to
these
add to
stories and
the
it's so impressive. It's good to see that many are doing very well. Jenny, were you going to add to that?
Yeah, just to add to that, I would challenge that mindset of the hesitation when it comes to scaling or growing. I'm 30 years old. I sold my company at 30 last year. And so really I put in a certain amount of years, almost a decade of running the company. I started right out of college, but I was really dedicated to growing and scaling and now be successfully exited at what we wanted to exit, which again I put in the years and got really out of it what I wanted to get out of it. And so the scaling and growing, it does require a certain amount of effort and sacrifice, but also if you stay at the same level and you do the same thing day in, day out, that is also, a sacrifice. At the end of the day, you have to weigh your option and maybe go through the growing pains and the scaling pains, but at the end of the day, it leads you to a beautiful goal and to a beautiful exit if you are ready to do what it takes. And I also personally really value the personal growth. I truly believe that in order to grow and scale a company, you have to grow and scale yourself. A company is only going to grow as much as you grow yourself. But we've done a lot of the consulting in the industry, outside of the industry, and just all the skills that I got out of that, of really starting a company out of a garage and growing it systematically. Now working through the equity transition, I'm learning so much every day, and I really enjoy that. And if you're a person that values growth, a lot of times business owners they like growth. I would say scaling is really worth it, even though you might have to sacrifice for some time and maybe put certain other things back.
Very good. Mark, anything?
I just wanted, so I just saw someone, it looks like Ivan Turner put a question in that I think really goes with
You can ignore Ivan if
what
you want to.
what's that, Ivan?
Oh, you
Ivan.
can talk.
So I think it fits in well with what Jenny just addressed. And the question was, what percentage of restoration companies have a plan? And the reality I think that is it'd be interesting for Chuck and JT to weigh in on this too. But most companies, if they have a plan, can double their top line and quadruple their bottom line in 3 to 5 years if they have a plan. Now that's not always. I mean, if it's $100 million business, that may at certain sizes of scale, it does get more difficult. But most restoration companies can achieve those metrics if they have a plan. I spoke recently at a conference. Actually, Chuck was there as well. And I asked a question, and there's about 175 entrepreneurs in the room. And I said, all right, show of hands. How many, everyone be honest here. What percentage of you in the room here have a strategic plan that you develop annually? How many people do you think raise their hand in the room there? What would be your
Not
guess?
enough. Not enough.
I think it was three.
Yeah.
Chuck, I was either 3 or 4. I think you were in there.
I was.
And so then you were definitely one of them. But it's a very, very small percentage of businesses that have a strategic or growth plan. And then I asked the follow-up question. I said, okay, now be honest, this was in October. How many of you have reviewed that plan in the last 90 days? And all 3 hands went down. And so the reality is this: businesses do not focus on strategic planning or strategic thinking and execution planning. And those are the keys to be able to prepare a business to really be able to get the results that are going to facilitate the goals that you're going to have for your family. So I think it's really, really important. It's a very, very small percentage of companies that actually do it. And that's why I think another question was, at what size should you have someone to help you with this process? You should have some of the team that you develop is so critical for the outcome that you're going to get. And so, Chuck, of course, now he doesn't have to blush because he's now the founder, but not the owner of Violand, right? But that's why you should hire someone like Violan management to come help you, or hire at the time that you're starting to think ahead of selling someone like JT, is because the outcome that you're going to have is going to be so much more significant than if you just try to go it alone and hope for the best outcome.
So we have
Yeah,
a
and I can
follow-up. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I really love what Mark was saying and kind of underline that we did the business planning with Beol and actually drew out a 5-year plan a few years back. And I specifically drew the org chart, our capital goals, our financial goals, and exactly our org structure, like the right people in the right places, which people I was envisioning 5 years down the road that would lead the company. And 3 years later, that plan became reality. And I pulled it back out and I was like, wow, that's amazing. So having a plan in place makes a huge difference. And the strategic planning is really what I believe set us up for success when it came to exit planning and helped us to really implement our strategy.
Appreciate that, Jenny. We do have a
Thank you.
follow-up question to what we just were talking about. And JT, why don't we start with you on this? Because it might be what you would look for initially when you take on a client. At what yearly sales volume or profit level would it be advisable to work with a consultant to facilitate a sale?
There isn't a floor to that.
Okay.
That's the short answer. You can be a small company and it can be sellable. Um, Chuck, I've referred some clients to Violan that are very small, and I've had people call in tears saying, I don't know what to do. I'm a slave to my company. I don't know how to take a step. And I can make a referral, and they say, I can't afford that. And we're not talking a lot of money. And my answer is, you can't not afford to hire a consultant. You need it. They're in their own personal version of hell trying to run their company. And that's not the reason anyone gets into business. So there's not a size that's too small to reach out to a consultant to get a plan. A plan is just wind in your sails and a breath of fresh air when some people are hanging on by their fingernails to the end of the rope. You've got to have a plan. And if it's consuming you, you have to get out of that or your business won't survive. And neither will you, frankly. You'll end up pulling the ripcord and doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeff, if I could jump in here real quick,
Yeah.
kind of piggybacking on Jennifer and also on JT's comments. Right, I 100% agree with you as far as the business plan and the value of that business plan. And Mark, your comments about the increasing the value of the business. Writing the business plan is only a first step. In many cases, it's the easiest step. It's the execution. And it's the following through on that plan that many small business owners were easily distracted. I think that was brought up earlier. Easily distracted, and we're tough. We're not so good with follow through. So if you have the plan, you actually have to follow through on it. Mark, just your question when we were together in that conference, when you asked that question, how many followed it through? That's the hard part. So you really have to commit to that.
Very good. Anything to add, Jenny or Mark? We are getting a lot of questions. We have time for a couple more, but I want to say this to those on the webinar. If our panelists would like to answer the questions that we can't get to live, maybe there can be some follow-up to this later on.
No,
Seem fair? Okay. We talked about, JT mentioned earlier that a company had a good weather event and thought they could sell their company for a lot of money based on that. So we have a question. Due to recent large losses in cat projects, sales and profitability have been inconsistent. How will this be viewed? So maybe some similar thoughts to the question we already had, but this might span a longer period of time. Mark, you want to start with that one?
So I think if any business has again, back to that customer concentration or cat concentration, it's going to be negative, right? JT mentioned earlier, and it's the way that when we looked at companies and acquired companies, if there was consistency to the cat events over a period of time, if we saw in the last 5 years, 3 out of those 5 years, there was something that we could build into our models to look at and forecast that moving forward, then there'd be some credit for it. But to the North Texas, I mean, same thing at in the company I was involved in. We had a bunch of people in the cat events. They're ready to sell now, right? It's like, oh, I better sell while we're at the high water point. First thing we're going to do is normalize that out of the earnings as we look at it. And so, in many ways, the challenge that I think every restoration company experiences is one where the cat seasons, as great as they are for the bottom line and the top line, they can breed some bad habits and complacency in the business because you have this windfall, because you have this chaos that results in sometimes a deviation from the standard operating procedures in the companies. They can actually be a negative. So, I would, any person, my advice to anyone who experiences that, to rather than thinking now's the good time to sell, because that's going to get found out right away. Rather, take that capital that you have now and invest in sustainability. And if you ever thought, I don't have the resources available to hire someone like Viola to come into my company, help me to plan, help me to be accountable to that plan, then take that money and do that. Because I promise that's what will pay the dividends in the future.
Good advice. Chuck, you might get some business out of this. We'll find out.
I'll tell you what, I'm mighty
Tim's getting the
grateful.
business. Tim's
I'm
getting
mighty
the
grateful.
business.
But Chuck will be happy because the legacy part plays into that.
Yeah,
Jenny,
that's right.
what do you think?
Yeah, it just aligned with what Mark said, really. And at the end of the day, as much as you can focus on your home base, you actually never pursued cat work. And people ask us all the time, like, why are you not traveling? Like, cat work is exciting, it's profitable, but it just never seemed to make sense. Like, I'm a person that get hyper focused, and so I was always hyper focused on building a local brand, reputation, home base. And at the end of the day, when it came to the exit, that really paid off. So I would, along the lines of what Mark said, just recommend to everyone who's considering an exit to hyper focus on making sure that you're building a solid base. And again, as Mark said as well, just wait maybe some longer before selling and get some more consistency in your numbers.
Okay. Jenny, we'll stay with you on this one. We're going to go around because I want to kind of rephrase the question a bit with different ones here. Once the business is sold, I've heard of owners staying on for a few months or up to a few years. Why the difference?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really a personal choice that's up for negotiation, and it depends on how open, the parties that you talk to, like what their approach is. Again, with Guardian Restoration Partners, and we were able to negotiate a shorter earnout period in comparison to some other parties that we talked to. But that's really something that's very specific to your company, your goals, where your company's at, what your company needs. Some companies might need a longer transition. Other companies, if you're in a place where an investor sees, like, especially if they have a CEO placement program, or and they bring in a general manager, you might be able to negotiate something on the shorter end. So again, it's highly personable and depends on the party that you're dealing with and your own goals.
So Jenny, how long did you stay with the company?
So we negotiated a 1 year or not.
Okay, 1 year. Mark, talk about your experience and your thoughts here.
Yeah, so I think that the shorter period you have as far as the requirement for an employment agreement or an earnout, and sometimes those are two separate things, sometimes they come together, is going to depend again on how well the business has been planned for the transaction. So if the business is highly dependent on the owner, you're going to be required to be there for a really long time. And for a lot of people, it just depends on where they are in their career. If you're 65 years old and you got a 5-year employment agreement, that might not be what you want. And there can be a lot of downside with that. So again, it goes back to just reiterate and reemphasize the importance of prior planning. If it's important to you that you have either a short earnout or shortened employment period, work on building that intangible capital in the business.
And Mark, how long did you stay with yours?
I stayed for 3 years, but I had a 1-year employment agreement.
Okay. You just love the job.
I love this. You know me. I just when
I
I thought
do.
I was out, they get me back in. So
When you told me you sold your company, I'm like, I don't see it. I know you love what you do, where it's at, and you were enjoying every moment of it.
yeah, that's
Uh,
right.
Chuck, let's go to you on this. You've sold your company. Are you going to buy a boat and sell off tomorrow or what?
I keep getting asked that question. No, I'm still employed. I do have an employment agreement with Tim. And so, it's kind of a two-way street, at least as far as I'm concerned, largely because of my age. I didn't want to be a burden to the organization. And certainly at my stage, I did not want to overstay my welcome. And so I wanted to be very sensitive to that. When I stopped bringing value, there's no sense in me being there. And I didn't want somebody to have to tell me that. So I was trying to work that with Tim in terms of, again, I didn't want to overstay my welcome. And I wanted to give him an easy out. If at some point he figures, you know what, Violand's just kind of hanging around here. I don't think we need that. So, but I still love what I do. I find great purpose in what I do. So he's been very gracious with me.
Yeah. So when Tim says, "Who's that guy in the coffee room?" Fake room. Chuck, thank
Exactly.
you. All joking aside, I know you're going to really enjoy your years coming up as well as everyone that sells your company. Um, JT, what do you normally see is there an average? Is there something you're seeing more often than not as far as how long someone stays on? Because you work with a lot of clients.
I do, and it's entirely dependent on the business. I would like to make one comment, though, from 30,000 feet. To those listening, sometimes it's hard to separate ownership from working. And they think if they sell, they have to work or not work, I'm sorry, that the two go hand in hand. And that is not the case. And there's a certain magic in taking a bunch of chips off the table, putting a nice check in your pocket, going back to work, helping grow the business. You're not accountable for the lease, the payroll, the expansion, the line of credit. Your name's not on any of that anymore. And yet you've got a vested interest. You can roll over some equity if you'd like. Sometimes that's preferable, and work for 3 to 5 years yet. That can be a real magical time. And depending on the growth in the business, that what we call the second bite, as your equity grows in the future, that can be worth some real money. And that growth is not on your dime. So for those listening, separate working and selling because they don't have anything in common. Okay.
Great
So it's when it comes to a normal length of time, the average smaller deal, let's say a $3 or $4 million SBA deal, certain requirements can't have a seller there longer than a year. They call it a culture of conflict because we've had an owner, he's had all the answers for a couple of decades, and now there's a new owner, and they don't like having sort of two bosses there. They view that as not good for the business. So typically those in that range, it's 3 to 9 months. We, introduce to key customers and vendors, and, a couple of months, 3 months of full time, and then a couple of months part time, and typically that individual's out. And on the larger transactions, based on rollover equity and the structure of the deal and the length of the earnout, there are individuals who negotiate a really long earnout, but they don't want to stay that long. And then there's others who will do a shorter earnout because they want to be there to control the results of that earnout. And so it's a very personal road ahead. And I always tell clients, you're in the driver's seat. And it's based on, when is your spouse going to retire and when are your kids going to be out of college and all the things that you want to accomplish. So it's kind of like the manual for raising kids. It doesn't really exist. You get to create it as you go. But learning what's important to you for the future is the roadmap. And oftentimes we can find a buyer that will accommodate that roadmap. And that's golden when it happens.
So, JT, have you ever seen the case where you had a successful company worth quite a bit of money, sell their business and walk away? The owner just walks.
Well, define quite a bit of money. Let's say north of 10 million, 20 million,
Sure.
something like that.
Is there ever just a turn?
It's really hard to do that. And when you say just walk, if you're talking
Here's the
toes up
key.
in the Caribbean,
Mhm.
toes up in the Caribbean in 30 days or less, that's really hard to accomplish because the owner is the insurance blanket for the buyer. They have to stay for a certain period of time. Now, I've had absentee owners, and when I mean absentee, living in different states, no day-to-day operations, they sit on 1 or 2 Zoom meetings a week with the staff. They can disappear pretty quickly. Most owners are not in that boat. So count on, you get north of 10, 12 million, count on a year, year and a half, 2 years. It can be shorter, but part of the expectation when I mentioned managing expectations is many people think they're going to sell and next month they're going to be out the door for good. And it rarely happens that way. You have to have yourself in an exceptional spot for that to occur.
Mm-hmm. Appreciate those thoughts. Good information. Chuck, Jenny, Mark, anything to add to that before we wrap up? We are almost out of time.
I think JT
I
handled
think
that
that,
very.
Okay.
nope, that's a, sorry, Chuck, go ahead.
No.
No, I was just gonna say, it can happen where it's toes up, but it's gonna come at a major valuation expense.
Yes,
So
thank you.
you better prepare that your valuation is gonna take a big haircut if you want toes up in the Caribbean next month. You know, the only thing I would say to, again, to this topic in general, Jeff, is that this is one of the most important decisions that any owner will make, is around this topic. And, you know, it's good for folks to educate themselves in a webinar like this, but this should just be the very beginning seeds. Hopefully some seeds are being planted here to really dive into what is going to impact the future of your family, the future of your team, the people that are most important to you. The sad reality is that 75% of owners who sell their business regret the decision within 1 year. So you got to get this right. And the only way you can get it right is with proper prior planning. One resource that I recommend highly, there's a book by a guy named Chris Snyder, who's the head of the Exit Planning Institute, called Walking to Destiny. I think anyone who's got, you know, this maybe has piqued some interest in them, they ought to pick that book up and start there, because it will help them unravel with a lot of really good stories like the ones that JT had, to think about, how do I grapple with this very, very important question?
Good words, Mark. We are
It's
out. We
a
have 1 minute, Jenny. If you want to say something, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really, really great point, Mark. And just to end on a last note, letting go of a company is like letting go of a piece of yourself. If you poured yourself, your heart, everything that you are into an organization for a long time, it is good to have at least a year to transition out. Also, not just to ensure that your legacy lives on, that everything is set up for future success, but also personally, it's a process of letting go and transitioning out. And I think if you exit sooner than a year, you don't really have that time to process that. So more so on a personal note, I think it's helpful to have a certain, even 2 or 3 years might be, depending on how long you've been involved as well, how big your company is, might be really helpful. And then again, don't have that stress, you're not responsible anymore for bankrolling the growth of the company. And it can be really rewarding, as JT said earlier too, if you just pull off some chips off the table and you have some pressure relieved and you have some equity support for growth. It can be attractive to retain talent, to attract great talent. So there's a lot of different options there.
Thank you, Jenny. And with that, we are out of time. But JT, Chuck, Jenny, Mark, thank you so much for giving up your time today. And those on the webinar, take this information, use it, and take it to the next level. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.